Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session Impacts of Agriculture and Tropical Ecosystems and Alternatives Towards Sustainability session. My name is Lucia Lohman, and I'm a faculty at the University of São Paulo and also the Executive Director of the ATBC. And I'm very happy to welcome all of you here today to what promises to be a super exciting session. So we have 6 speakers today, being Zeudi from Stockholm University, Jaime Reyes from the Universidad Militar Nueva Granada in Colombia, Adrián González Chaves from the Universidade de São Paulo in Brazil, Crinan Jarrett from the University of Glasgow, Meredith Martin from North Carolina State University, and Kayana Pike from James Cook University. Special thanks to Kayana, who's woken up so early to attend this session from Australia. So I guess we'll get started with our movies and we'll get all the questions at the end. So please make sure to post your questions through the Q&A button and not through the Whova platform. And we'll be very happy to answer questions at the end. And we're looking forward to a very lively discussion. Thank you so much. Enjoy the talks.
Hi all, my name is Zeudi. Welcome to my presentation on the relationship between biodiversity and coffee yield in Arabica coffee's native range. Tropical rainforests are recognized to have high biodiversity value. However, fueled by high population growth rate, deforestation, forest degradation, and intensification of agriculture are the ongoing threats to biodiversity in this region. More than 90% of the tropical biodiversity occurs in human-modified landscapes. For example, the photo to the right shows one of the owners of our sites, smallholders who own our sites. And thus, smallholder farmers depend on the forest for their livelihoods. Therefore, livelihood and biodiversity need to be balanced. In southwestern Ethiopia, coffee grows along a broad management gradient that varies in terms of shade tree density and diversity and coffee management. The photos show a typical coffee shrub structure along the gradient, and the top photos show typical canopy cover gradient along the management intensity gradient. Our study was conducted in southwestern Ethiopia. Across the landscape, we selected 60 sites that varied in terms of coffee management. And at each site, we created a plot of 50 by 50, where we recorded biodiversity, coffee yield, and management-related variables. The aim of this project was to explore the trade-offs and shape of biodiversity yield relationships in Coffee Arabica's native range. For this, we studied woody species, herbaceous plant species, and bryophytes as biodiversity components, and coffee yield in all the 60 sites. Our specific questions were, how do biodiversity, that means species richness and composition, relate to coffee yield? And what is the shape of the relationship? Here, we show the relationship between species richness and average coffee yield for the different species groups. For this specific case, the y-axis is woody species richness and the x-axis is average coffee yield for 3 consecutive years. Woody species declined fast initially until a certain level of yield, after which it leveled out. So woody species has a concave relationship to yield. On the other hand, herbaceous species richness and bryophyte species richness did not have a relationship to coffee yield. Total species richness had a similar trend to woody species richness, but the relationship here, it was not significant. Here, we show the relationship between species composition and coffee yield. On the y-axis, here is RD axis of species composition of the different species groups, and the x-axis is average coffee yield. In all the species groups, the species composition changed rapidly along the yield gradient, and the species composition yield relationship is concave. As a summary and conclusion, our results suggest that there is a strong trade-off between biodiversity yield and yield in Arabica coffee's native range, specifically in the less intensively managed sites. This could be due to the broad management gradient in this landscape. And our results suggest that different approaches need to be adopted to reconcile biodiversity conservation and livelihood in this landscape. For the less intensively managed part of the landscape, where Coffee Arabica occurs as a wild, a land-sparing approach whereby this part of the landscape is strictly protected, and the other part of the landscape can be intensified for more yield, could be good to increase biodiversity in this part of the landscape. Another approach is to use land sharing, whereby a farmer can maximize his yield by planting both coffee and other crops. But in this part, incentives like coffee certification can motivate the farmer to grow coffee under diverse shade to increase biodiversity. I would like to thank my promoters and collaborators, and this research was funded by Swedish Research Council. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, my name is Crinnan and I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some of our ongoing work on understanding the relationship between biodiversity and yields in tropical agroforestry from a community-wide perspective. So the problem we're trying to tackle here is the fact that the relationship between the management applied to an agroforestry system, the biodiversity it can contain, and the yields it can produce is very complex. So this is nicely illustrated in this diagram by Barnes et al. And the main thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that there are so many arrows linking the land use or the management to different groups like macroinvertebrates, arthropods, birds, etc. So of course, the management applied to an agroforestry system will have varying effects on different species in the community. These species in the community might interact with each other. Some species in the community might interact directly with yields, like pests or pollinators, and some species in the community might interact indirectly with yields. So this is a very complex system, and of course it's difficult to capture this using sort of traditional statistical techniques like correlations. Also, these methods like correlations don't give us a lot of information on what mechanisms are driving these relationships. So our aim here is to sort of fill that knowledge gap by creating a community model that represents our study system, which is Cameroonian cocoa farms. So this is ongoing work. The model is not yet finalized, but I will sort of explain the process we're going through to get there. So the model we want to create is pictured in this slide. You can see that there are 3 trophic levels. At the top we have insectivorous birds and bats. In the middle we have arthropods, some of which are pests and some of which aren't. And at the bottom, of course, we have the cocoa yields. The model also contains the relationships that exist between these species. And the model will be representative of cocoa farms on a sort of gradient of management. So of course, according to the management applied to a farm, you're going to have a different community composition. You might even have different relationships between species, and these things will have consequences on the yield. So we'll effectively have a different model according to the management applied to a farm. And our aim here is to be able to make predictions that can tell us about what community composition to expect, what interactions to expect, and what yields to expect according to the management applied to a farm. And of course, we'd like to arrive at some sort of management which can maximize both the community composition or the biodiversity and the yields. But how do we create this model? Well, there's 2 main ingredients. The first ingredient is that for each of the species included in the model, we need a reliable estimate of population size. So to do this, we're using data from Cameroonian cocoa farms. It's 28 farms pictured in this map on the right-hand side here that we visited between 2 and 6 times since 2018. And these farms are on a gradient of management. In this case, by management, I mean canopy cover. So the density of the canopy is sort of a proxy for how intensively managed the farm is. In these farms, we sampled birds, bats, arthropods, and cocoa yields. So we sampled birds and bats using mesh netting and acoustic recordings. We sampled arthropods using sweep netting, malaise traps, and visual surveys. And we sampled cocoa yields by asking the farmers. So the second ingredient for this community model is knowing which species are interacting with each other. So of course, in the community, not all species will be interacting with each other, and so we want to be able to provide the model with some information on what interactions to expect. So to get at these interactions, we're using 2 methods. The first method is to understand the relationships between the predator level and the arthropod level, and the method is fecal metabarcoding. So we collected fecal samples from birds and bats, we extracted the DNA, we sequenced it, and that way we can sort of establish the links between which bird and bat groups are eating which arthropod groups. Then, to understand which arthropod groups are eating the cocoa, we did direct observations. So we basically did transects in which we distinguished which arthropods are eating cocoa and which aren't. So finally, we're going to feed these 2 ingredients into the model. And what we hope is that we can make predictions about what management to apply to a cocoa farm in order to maximize both yield and the diversity of the community. So that's all from me. I hope that was it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I look forward to hearing all your talks, and I hope I can answer some questions. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Jaime Reyes. I work with two PhD, Pedro Jimenez and Alejandra Jaramillo, professor from the Military University from Colombia. Our work is titled Divers of Tropical Insects Visiting Cocoa Flowers. Why are we interested in cocoa? On one hand, we are interested in cocoa for being a product of global interest, and also with interesting economic and cultural benefits. More than 50 million people depend on the cocoa for their livelihood. But on the other hand, we are facing a climate change that influencing unexpected cocoa deficit, as well as lack of knowledge of biological aspects of cocoa. When we look at the bibliography and we found that an estimated 100 cocoa flowers, only 2 or 3 will be pods, we ask ourselves several questions. One of them, how does pollination affect the production? In 2020 in Sulawesi, Indonesia, Martinez found that the production increased the pollination and increased the profits 59%. They are a percentage that we cannot ignore. Our study area is located in Huila Department at the south of Colombia. Paicol is a town based on agriculture and tourism. The structure of the area is a tropical dry forest. We studied 7 farms, some near to the forest and others far from it. We decided to study 3 different topics. First one is floral biology. We need to know what's going on in every single stage of the flower. Second, flowers visitor. We want to know the difference of insects between day and night and also near and far from the forest. Finally, visitors versus pollinators. We have to differentiate these terms if in the future we want to talk about production. To carry out this work, we made direct observation and we write down each inch of the floral structure since the flower was closed. Also, every hour since the flower opened, we did a stigmatic receptivity test with the hydrogen peroxide. For the insects, we only took into account those that were on the flower. This is one of the proofs we have. In this one is one of the time-lapse video that we made. In this case, it's the recording of a night. We see that the movement of the flower is made at night. With the data from the videos and the direct observation, we were able to differentiate the floral anthesis by the stages. With the data, we built this figure of floral biology, showing us that the female and male stage of the flower do not overlap, that the flower falls between the 4 and 5 days if it's not pollinated. The movement of the flower are carried out at night, preparing for the day, or when there is more flower visitors activity. In the case of species richness, we saw an increase of Coleoptera, Diptera, Hymenoptera when they are near to the forest. But while there is more abundance of dipters away from the forest. In short, we saw an increase of species richness when being close to the forest. While being far from it, we found less richness and greater abundance. In floral visitors through the day, it's evident that Hymenoptera lead the richness and the abundance, but at night, Coleoptera appears showing us the dominance that we cannot underestimate. This table showing us the importance to study the nocturnal floral visitors of cocoa. Here we can see the different plants and insects interactions. Some are within with the floral structures, while others can prey on the cocoa flowers. We need to clarify that the floral visitor is very different from a pollinator. A pollinator is a contact with the male and female parts of the flower, as well as the ability to transport pollen, not just the pollen that the insect uses. Here's an example. This bee has pollen on its abdomen and also in another parts of its body, but not just in the corbicula. These are some of the many conclusions we have, but one of them is certainly that important parts of the history are still missing. Thanks for listening, and if you have any question, do not hesitate to contact us and talk more about the subject. Thank you.
My name is Meredith Martin. I'm currently at the NC State University, but I'm going to be presenting on work that I did as a postdoc at Yale School of the Environment with co-authors from Yale and from the Nature Conservancy. This project was an assessment of tree planting and reforestation projects in the tropics and subtropics around the world. And there's been a real increase in interest in tree planting as a solution to many social and environmental problems, but very little assessment on the broad scale of what these tree planting organizations and tree planting projects are actually doing, or at least what they're reporting to be doing. So we compiled a database of 174 unique organizations that are engaging in tree planting and reforestation in the tropics and subtropics. We found these through a combination of Google searches of Global Giving and Charity Navigator, treenation.org. And for all of the organizations that met our criteria, we recorded a large amount of information on the organizations, on where they worked, where they were headquartered, the number of trees planted, the reforestation restoration methods they used, and the species that they report using. And we found that overall, there's been a real dramatic increase in the number of organizations dedicated to tree planting and tropical reforestation in the last few decades, which isn't a surprise. We also found that the headquarters of these organizations were much more commonly located in the global north, even though many of the projects are found in the global south. And we found that overall, organizations reported planting a total of 1.4 billion trees since 1961. We also calculated the reported mean annual rate from all of these organizations, and we found that it would still take over 1,000 years to plant 1 trillion trees, which has been named as a goal by many of these kind of broad-scale tree planting initiatives. I also want to note that these numbers are all self-reported by the organizations, so we were not, of course, able to independently verify whether they have in fact planted these number of trees or restored the area that they said. We also found that the species that organizations report using, by and large, tended to be utilitarian species. So by that, we mean species that have some sort of commercial timber or fruit or agricultural service or product. This is a list of the top 7 most commonly reported species. So we have cacao, we have teak, moringa, mango, coffee, mahogany, and avocado, all commercial species, of course. And we see that they're often being planted well outside of their native ranges. So in bold are countries where they're being planted that are within the native range, and in italics are countries where they're being planted outside of the native range. And this interest in utilitarian species is really mirrored in the restoration reforestation techniques that these organizations report using. So almost half report using agroforestry as a reforestation technique, and many fewer report using more sort of natural ecological methods such as assisted natural regeneration or relying on natural regeneration. And this is just a small sample of the different techniques that people reported. But I also want to note that there was a real lack of specificity and information on the type of reforestation technique used. So about half of organizations didn't even specify what type of method they were using, beyond saying planting. And again, many organizations didn't report any of the species, and of those that we did, almost a quarter mentioned only a single species, and half reported fewer than 5 species. And we see that these organizations really are trying to meet multiple objectives by using these utilitarian species and these utilitarian methods. So based on the mission statements, we found a lot of commonly used words had to do with people and economic development, which makes sense based on these species. But we also found that a lot had to do with conservation and biodiversity. And so, of course, tropical reforestation can achieve multiple benefits, but there are also going to be trade-offs depending on the species that are used. And additionally, we want to note that there may be a risk going forward if this same suite of species is being commonly planted throughout the world in the tropics and subtropics. There may be a risk of some sort of homogenization of flora over time. Finally, regardless of what species are used, we found that very few organizations discussed monitoring on their websites or in their reports. Only 18% mentioned monitoring at all, and only 8% mentioned measuring survival. And this is obviously enormously important, as ultimately the number of trees that are planted doesn't matter nearly as much as the number of trees that survive. And so ultimately, we think that there really needs to be clearer communication between the donors, the organization, and the scientific community on what's being done and what would be best practices. Thank you very much.
Hello, we're going to talk today about forest age affecting coffee yield across large regions. Why talking about forest age? Well, because we are in the decade of ecosystem restoration. That's because most of the land has already been transformed, and in order to preserve biodiversity, we need to restore some of the ecosystem so they can also contribute to human well-being. One example is the Atlantic forest cover, where natural regeneration has been shown to be key for achieving cost-effective forest restoration. What do we know about secondary forests? Well, they already shown their work showing that they contribute to the recovery of biodiversity. This has been shown for several taxons and within a short period of time. And forests are also showing the ability to recover their biomass resiliency. So they're able to contribute with a carbon stock. But the majority of lands that needs to be restored is within private properties. So how do we get farmers involved in such a large landscape restoration? And in the case of Brazil and the Atlantic forest, the environmental law already requires restoration to take place, but this has yet to happen. So thinking that land use is mainly driven by economic decisions, how do we get farmers involved? And we had already been shown that the amount of forest within surrounding coffee fields is a good predictor of coffee productivity across the whole Atlantic forest. That's 600 municipalities. And as forest increased, we found that also there was a high productivity. This was shown for forest surrounding coffee in 2 kilometers radius. So what we wanted to ask now was whether the forest age of surrounding coffee fields would affect coffee productivity. And we expect that younger forests would modulate the effect of forest on yield. For that, we use these forest maps that there is annual data on where the forest is located, which allowed us to reclassify the forest fragments according to their age, whether they were younger than 20 years or older than 20 years. And we calculated the amount of forest in the surrounding at different scales. We use a previous fitted model that had been shown that forest was one of the most important variables. This after comparing with management practice and climatic variables. And we included the age to see if this affected yield. And what we found is that forest cover was interacting with young forest cover on a smaller scale, and there seems to be a threshold above which the amount of young forest cover in the landscape can have a positive effect on coffee yields, contrary to what happens below that threshold. And this is probably associated to the community of bees and natural pest enemies that is being hazed. While above that threshold, there would be a more diverse community. In a more simplified community, you might be providing resources for pests or bees that not necessarily contribute to pollination. What we suggest is that age needs to be taken into account when developing policies, because there's a delay in the possibility of forest to contribute to coffee yield. We would suggest that other management strategies like agroforestry are taken into account in order to encourage farmers to get involved with restoration. Thank you very much, and please get in touch if you have any questions.
Hi everyone, my name's Kayana. I'm a PhD candidate at James Cook University in Australia, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today about my research on giant tortoises and their interaction with agriculture in the Galapagos. So for most people, when I mention Galapagos, they picture a paradise. This is especially true for biologists. They imagine these beautiful tropical islands which are full of amazing wildlife. But what many people don't know is that Galapagos is also home to about 30,000 people and visited by more than 200,000 tourists each year. So unfortunately, this can lead to a little trouble in paradise. This is because sometimes it's difficult to meet the needs both of wildlife and people with the same resources, which can lead to human-wildlife conflict. So my research looks at the tortoise farmer conflict which is emerging in the Galapagos. So to give you some background, on the island of Santa Cruz, there are 2 species of giant tortoise, and both are critically endangered. During the dry season, most adult tortoises migrate from the arid lowlands when food becomes limited to the humid highlands, which you can see as the dark green area on the map. Now, this habitat is much more consistently productive. And this is also what makes it great for agriculture. So now that 88% of the humid highlands has been converted to support farms. This is now the grey area that you can see on the map covering most of the humid highlands. Farming mostly began in the 1900s or so, and now agriculture has farms ranging from cattle ranching to coffee production. So with both tortoises and farmers needing to use the humid highlands, this can lead to a few issues, such as fences being broken, crops being eaten, and we also know very little on how interacting with this human-modified land may be impacting these critically endangered ecosystem engineers. So we designed a study to try to understand this interaction a little better. Our goals here were to investigate the spatial and temporal patterns of farm use by tortoises to support tortoise-farmer coexistence. To do this, we attached GPS tags to 45 adult tortoises and recorded their movements over a 9-year period while they were in farmland. So what we found is that the average tortoise may spend about 150 days in farms, which is a decent amount of time. Whilst they're in farmland, a tortoise is likely to visit 4 different properties, but it may only use each of these properties a small amount. So it's about 10% for lower intensity activities like traveling between sites, and only about 1% is used with a higher intensity for things like foraging. We also found that tortoises have a very strong tendency to use the same areas repeatedly. So to give you an example, if we look at the space used by one of our tortoises named Alison, who visited the agricultural area 3 times while we tracked her, on the left, you can see the areas she used in each visit, shown as the orange, green, and blue blobs over the grey farmland. Now, the scale bar gives us 400 meters for comparison, showing overall she's not taking up too much space. When we put all 3 of these visits on the same map, we can see they are virtually stacked on top of each other, which you can see on the right. This shows us that she's using the same areas again and again. So what do all of these results mean, and how can we use them? Well, by doing this research on the spatial and temporal patterns of farm use, we now have a much better idea of the extent of the interaction between tortoises and farmers, based on the estimates we got of how much time and space they use there. We also have an idea of how many landholders each tortoise might interact with, which can help facilitate land use planning, as well as help to advise things like when to grow certain crops so that they don't overlap with peak tortoise use. Now, at the end of the day, it's hoped that this research can help keep tortoises and farmers living in a paradise in Galapagos. Thanks everyone for your time, and thanks especially for the many organizations who have supported this research. If you'd like to know more about our research, you can find it in the published article listed on the slide.
I'd like to invite all the panelists and speakers to now turn your cameras on so we can get the discussion started. Wow, that was super exciting. I really, really enjoyed all the talks, and it's actually really nice how all of them actually connect to each other. So I would like to start by asking a couple questions that we have here at the Q&A. And I see that there's some that have been answered, but I actually would like to give you also an opportunity to answer them live. So there is, let's start first with the question for Beyin. And so the question is, I find interesting that your curve on trees and productivity does not continue to lower, but stay stable at higher yields. Would you like to encourage that flat end of the curve, manage biodiversity?
Thank you for this nice question. And yes, this landscape is unique in that it is a place where coffee arabica is found wild, where there is no management, and it occurs along a gradient of management. And in the little managed areas of the landscape, coffee is not at all managed and only harvested from the forest. So the yield is very low. That is due to like the shading effect of the large density of trees in the area. But when one moves to the more intensively managed areas, the productivity increases, but biodiversity decreases. And that biodiversity decrease is like mostly in the less managed part of the landscape. Because the smallholder farmers in this landscape heavily depend on the coffee for their livelihood, management of coffee is important. So they have to make their own living. And to encourage biodiversity in this part of the landscape, in the managed areas, coffee certification programs whereby farmers are motivated to plant more trees in their landscape will be recommended. And also, of course, farmers do not only depend on coffee in this landscape, they get other revenues like from spices and honey production, and also they get their firewood and like construction materials from the forest. So like it's not only the yield that is that we need to see in this landscape. So the forest has other services as well. So we encourage like growing coffee under diverse shades. So yeah, managed biodiversity is important. And if I have to answer the other question, like why biodiversity and plant diversity and biodiversity and yield and productivity are like contrasting, while bird and bat diversity is like has no effect on yield. Birds and bats could be important in coffee plantation because they are natural parasites, natural biocontrol agents on pests. They feed on several pests in the coffee system, and they don't have also like a direct effect on coffee. So birds and bats do not consume coffee, and that would have been dangerous. So they could have like no effect on each other. But when we come to especially plant diversity, tree diversity, as the number of trees increases, then the shade, due to the shading effect, the relationship will be negative. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I actually have a question for Krinan now, which is, so you showed us a beautiful study and such a nice model. And I really enjoyed thinking about the relationship between biodiversity and yield. And it's amazing that you considered like multiple trophic levels and the system really allowing us to make predictions about which communities to expect, and also including really cutting edge tools like, you know, DNA sequencing and a bunch of different things. And so I have a question that is more of a practical. So in some instances, like for example, you show that we need reliable estimates of population size, and there's some variables that are not always easy to find in tropical systems. So I would like to ask if you have any recommendations for how somebody could apply your model, but under, you know, limited circumstances where not all variables and informations about species interactions. And so let's say less ideal circumstances, how could the model also be applied?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the enthusiasm. So in fact, I mean, in many ways, like the data we have from the field is not perfect, and it was collected under sort of limited circumstances. So maybe the process we've gone through is actually helpful for other people as well. Like maybe when it up on the slide, it looked like we had this unlimited, perfect data collection, but that was really not the case. So what I've been doing is to, in most cases, for example, to estimate the abundance of species, I've been using a sort of a statistical technique where you combine different sources of data. So for example, I said that for birds and bats, we used mist netting and acoustic detections. And so what I've done is to create like an integrated model that combines these two data sources in order to get a more reliable estimate of abundance. Because for example, it'll, you know, like for example, mist netting has biases. You know, when you go in the field and you catch birds, you tend to catch more birds in habitats with more understory or something like that. So all these methods have their problems. And so what I'm trying to do is like draw information from each other to get more reliable estimates of abundance. So already there's these like imperfections that I'm having to deal with, I guess, statistically at the you know, after the data collection to make up for it. And then the meta-barcoding part, which is obviously relatively high tech, I guess. I think it could be easily, well, I don't know if easily, but it could be substituted by like direct observation or something like this to have an idea of who's eating what. And then these information go into like the information on the interactions go into the model in the form of priors. And this is a Bayesian model, so it can take prior information. So even if you have just an idea, or like, I mean, you know, this is debatable, but in theory, if you have like an idea based on some field observations, you could provide that to the model as well, even if you didn't have like a really comprehensive set of meta-barcoding data. So I'm hoping we can make it sort of generalizable to systems with more limited data. But as I say, we're already having to compensate a lot for shortcomings in the field. So by no way it should seem like something that's been this like perfect data collection protocol.
It was such an elegant model and such really, really interesting study. Really well done. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
And I have a question for Jaime. And the question is, well, so it starts by saying, very interesting topic and congratulations for the research. Did you also identify the flower visitors to a lower taxonomic level or only to the order level? And then it also says, I'm curious which families of Diptera and Hymenoptera you find, and whether they're common pollinator groups in the region.
Well, hi, everyone. In the case of the identification of the insects, we are working on that. We found a different kind of like the species or interested in, like, for example, in pollinators, we try to classify this kind of species. For example, we have more Hymenoptera in this case, and we found the Meliponini, one of the families is more important right now in the coffee, in the cocoa. We are also working on that because we have a lot of data. We have more like 8,000 data from these cacao trees. That's why we are still working on that.
And actually there's a second part, which is just, so it's one small question. What distances were you considering as close and far from the forest?
We choose our farms. We have 7 farms. Some of them we say like they are close to the forest because they are they have some connection with the forest and also with the corridors or are inside the forest. For that reason, we say like is in the forest. But in the case of the others, they are far away, is because it's surrounded for other crops and also is close to the another towns. Is no kind of connectivity with directly with the forest. And also we find the diversity and also the abundance of the species of insects is really differentiated from one each other.
Thank you very much. And I actually have a question for Meredith now. And I really enjoyed her presentation because that's actually something I've been thinking a lot about. So we see all these projects and we all wonder, like, what are these tree planting projects actually doing? And are they doing it well? And I was hoping that they were doing much better than what you showed us, actually. And it was really worrisome in some ways to see this, so really high interest only on the utilitarian species and few natural ecological processes, and no reporting on the reforestation techniques used, no report on the number of species used, the same species being planted all over, and low monitoring. So it's very worrisome, and your database is fantastic. You looked at so many different sites. It's just, I just wished we had that for all over the world. And I was just thinking, so in practical terms, and how could we use this data to actually better inform the community, better inform the donors, and really take the most out of all the data you've collected?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to throw in the caveat that it's very possible that these projects are doing more and planting more species and that they're just not communicating that clearly. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but I think, I think it points to a real need for more communication about what the most effective methods for restoring large areas are. Obviously, there's a ton of research on natural regeneration being incredibly effective and all these other methods. And I'm not sure that that information is really reaching the donors who, if you're an organization looking for money, it sounds better to say, well, we planted 1 million trees than to say we did nothing and forest is regrowing. So I'm guessing that that plays a big part in it. But I think that also there may be just lack of access to seeds and to nurseries that are growing a wider variety of native species. We know very well how to grow cacao and how to grow coffee. There's a lot of information about germination and pollination and all of these things that we're studying very carefully. And I think that we need more research and maybe local databases with species that might be commercially valuable, but might be more localized to specific regions to try to encourage kind of that increased diversity and increased kind of localization of projects in different places. But there's a lot of work ahead of us, I think, in bridging those gaps.
Yeah, the whole homogenization issue is really worrisome, and especially in the face of climate change, because all species might be affected.
And I would say also, as we've seen from these other speakers, just the fact that you're planting coffee could mean totally different things depending on where you are, if you have shade, all of these different things. So I think we need to have more care in what we're doing.
Well, and in some ways is, so you mentioned also the issue of communication, that, you know, these companies need to communicate in a better way, which I feel is a big issue right now. And even so, there's a lot of companies nowadays that are doing environmentally friendly things and supposedly to, you know, but it's really hard as a consumer to evaluate which companies to follow and how they're doing things better. So I wonder if there might be a way to do like an incentive system or a green stamp or some kind of more detailed evaluation that consumers could go to into a website and just search, okay, you know, gather all the information in the one place.
Yeah, it's really challenging. I mean, I think obviously for coffee, there's certifications, and for chocolate, there are some certifications. One thing that I didn't discuss in the presentation, but I think is also a problem if organizations are not doing it, is it's not enough to just plant coffee or cacao somewhere. You need to have a reliable supply chain to actually bring some sort of economic development and to maintain those things. And so whether that can be linked with a certification system that promotes you know, a more complicated sort of shade-grown biodiverse system or not, could be great. But I think even just that step of, you can't just plant these things and walk away, it's not going to be sustainable. But it's a challenging subject.
Super, super interesting. And there's a question now for Adrián. And so it starts by saying, well, nice talk. And under your study system, how were the coffees grown? Is under a shade or without shade trees?
So, well, first, thanks for the opportunity, and it's great to see all these talks. It's been very interesting. And so I think the short question is, it's mainly sun coffee plantation, which is what dominates in Brazil. But what I'm using is government data. So it's on productivity at the municipality level. So there might be some shade plantations or agroforestry management, but this is a small part. I think there was a data from 2014 that I think more than 90% of the coffee production in Brazil is under a sun system, so without shade. So I think that's, but reminding that in Brazil you have this law that every property must have a set aside land for conservation. So what I was looking at, it was the forest next to the coffee plantations or within the farm. So yeah, that's kind of the problem when you kind of want to upscale the analysis. You want to assess larger regions, but then the data it's less available. But hopefully someday, you know, like with data like Meredith was talking about, you can have information on what kind of production there is across the regions, and eventually get to something like what you were saying, Lucia, to get information available for consumers to know what we're having. One of the drivers behind the research I was working is like, do we know where our coffee is coming from and how it's being produced and what is the biodiversity associated to them? I think like if we as consumers have this worry, and as biologists we can help out on giving away this information, then we may help towards the change.
Yeah, so that's actually something really interesting and different in Brazil, that a lot of the protected areas are actually within private lands, which is not something common in different parts of the world. So I was thinking about if you had any suggestions about how we could actually encourage the farmers to get more involved in the restoration projects within their farmland. So I don't know if maybe there could be more governmental incentives, or so from a practical viewpoint, how can we get them more encouraged to do things, or an incentive system, or do you have any ideas on that?
Well, I think there is some examples from our speakers in these sessions. I think like Meredith was saying, like there is an interest on incorporating plants, trees that have uses, so economic uses. There is a relationship with productivity that we cannot look like we need to take into consideration. So I think because it's in private lands, we have to find economical way to get this done, to get farmers involved. And there's this approach of landscape and forest restoration in which you can use agroforestry as a way of transitioning to a restoration project. So I think, for example, in Brazil, we need to incentivize shade coffee production, and maybe market is a way to get this done. But I've seen some examples also from Brazil where there's capacity building with smallholders to do nursery systems in order to get this implemented at the local scale. So I think there are some different ways in which we can get this done, and I think we're in a point that we need to articulate the different initiatives that are being done. I think there are several examples. Again, we know that shades, there are already evidence that not necessarily are affecting productivity. So why is not being implemented? Well, you need to get the trees at the height in which you can incorporate it in your land, and this you need nurseries. But so far, nurseries are not widely being promoted. So, and this is an economic activity as well. So I mean, I think it's a whole like chain within the production that needs to be articulated, from how to get the tree seedlings in order to then be available for producers to take on this thing. Because, for example, in Brazil, again, you have the law asking farmers to restore, but you're also allowing compensation to take place in another farm. So.
Thank you so much. And I have a question for Kayana now, which is, so first of all, it was so fascinating to learn more about the tortoises. And I had a chance to visit Galapagos and I was just enchanted. What a beautiful place. So, well, first, you continue to do work there?
Not currently, just because of the situation we're in.
Well, yeah,
but yeah, this is my PhD work, and so that was my first chapter, and I'm working on subsequent chapters from data that I've collected previously on other facets of that system. So that was really just looking at, in general, time and space they're using, and now I'm also looking into how they respond to things like roads and fences and farm infrastructure. And I'm also interested in the distribution of different land use types. So coffee as well is something that's grown in the Galapagos, and I'm looking at how tortoises use coffee areas, also relating to livestock areas and that sort of thing. So there's a bunch of different things that I'm looking at with that whole interaction between tortoises and farms in Galapagos. Yeah, so maybe you could see some sort of tortoise coffee certification or tortoise-friendly coffee or something one day.
This is really neat, and it's such an iconic organism. It's really, really great. Are there data for other organisms associated with the same system in addition to tortoises? Like, have anyone documented similar patterns for other organisms in the region?
As in terms of other organisms using the agricultural land?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's a number of endemic species in Galapagos that are in the agricultural area, because the way that it is, it's a specific habitat type where all the agriculture is. So there's also within this framework of all of these different land use types, it's still an important habitat for a lot of Darwin's finches, for example, a lot of bird species. You find a number of invertebrates and that sort of thing there as well. So it does still have some conservation value and ecological value beyond just agricultural land sort of thing. So tortoises are one thing that use this habitat still, but there's many other organisms, where that's important. Thanks for the question.
Really nice. I actually have a question now that is for all of you, and maybe we can just walk each one and see what you have to comment on that. And so one thing that I've been really inspired by in this conference is that we're really seeing a lot more on the intersection between ecological and social approaches. And I think that before, the ecological research used to get much more attention and even publicity than the actual social aspects, but really integrating the ecology and social, this is really urgent and the most needed aspect for us to truly solve some of the challenges. And so I wanted to ask, based on your systems, if you have any suggestions or thoughts about can we better integrate those aspects, and even perhaps how can we better conduct more multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary research in which we really integrate people working on the social aspects in our own research. So any thoughts about that? Somebody volunteers to go first?
I can hop in, and I don't have a simple answer to that, except that I have always thought that that's really, really important. And I come from sort of a forestry background where we're thinking about forest ecology from the realm of use and production and things like that. But I think that a big step, as you say, is simply ecologists and wildlife biologists recognizing that people are an important part of this equation and are not going away. And I think we're increasingly realizing that, protected areas alone are not going to be enough to halt climate change, to save biodiversity, to provide the ecosystem services and things that we need. And so I think that there is a growing recognition that we need to think more about landscape as a matrix and integrating agriculture and forestry and maybe more wild areas all together. So honestly, I think just changing the viewpoint of scientists has been a really important first step for getting out there, but I'm not sure what the next step is.
Really great. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And just seeing the change is people realizing the importance and seeing the change and thinking about it, because it's really contrasting from previous conferences. It's a huge improve. Jaime?
Yep. But in the case in Colombia, for example, in cocoa on different farmers, we have like for example, for coffee, many farmers they are conscientized about the climate change and different problems that we have, and also I believe they have a lot of empiric acknowledgement, and when we talk with them, sometimes they really know how they want to make the change or make better in the file. For example, in cocoa, we found it's better to have trees with the high level. And also there's no like, oh no, I don't want that. They are the first person to say, I want the change, I want to help. Is the kind of people like the professional have to integrate with the normal people, that it means with the farmers, get in his level and try to explain with different words, no like the scientific word. So, it's try to get inside them, but with the equal, and maybe we have a better connection and they understand better everything to make the change. And also it's happening now.
Super. Adrian, please.
Yeah. So I think something in ecology that is always been like a goal is to have long-term studies, and this is always like a big challenge. And I think just adding up to what was said is working with local communities at different levels, comparative if it's a production of a commodity crop or just directly the people involved in the place is a way forward, because like, for example, us as students have a short time in which we have to develop a project, but the people living there are just going to be more directly affected by what's going on. So how we get these people involved, and then if we can somehow get projects that the students can follow up on what's being done, it's just be a great opportunity. I mean, I wonder what would be of me in 5-10 years forward, like what would I be working on? And I think some ideal work is just to be doing some kind of capacity building to get these ideas and knowledge implemented and being learning from people actually living in these places. So I think for me, capacity building is something that should help to get this bridge better.
Thank you.
Yes. In my study landscape also, it's very important to engage societal aspirations and biodiversity conservation. So the interaction is very important. For a successful biodiversity conservation, the farmers which do not have the knowledge about the future climate change should be part of a discussion, and they should be informed about the decisions. So it shouldn't be only from the top to down, and that is very important. And there are recently initiatives that study about societal aspirations. For example, in my landscape, it contains a wild forest where coffee genetic diversity is high, and coffee genetic diversity occurs only in that part of the landscape in the world. So for example, benefits for farmers through something that is obtained through sharing genetic pool with the world would be very important. So ignoring farmers by any means will not be good for a successful biodiversity conservation. So there is recently an effort to work on both societal and ecological issues in my study landscape as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, before we get the last two comments, there's another comment on the chat that is closely related to what we are seeing, and then maybe you can comment and include this topic in the discussion. So it's a comment from Eat Arn, and it says, so I completely agree with Lucia's comment about interdisciplinary work and integration of social and ecological sciences. Is there any scope in your study sites to set up integrated studies with social scientists or working with extension specialists to set up demonstration plots, working with stakeholders, farmers, landowners, etc.? So maybe Krinan and Kayana can start.
Yeah, so I think we're sort of starting this in our study site. So one of the people who is working with us doing the actual data collection is now, who's from Cameroon. She's now going back and revisiting all the farmers and sort of presenting some findings and trying to kind of feed back into the system. But I just wanted to say that I went to a talk in the last session by Carolina Ocampo, and she's really, I think, got this down, combining social and ecological issues, and her sort of conclusion, well, not conclusion, but she talked about increasing diversity at all levels. So increasing biological diversity, but also increasing diversity of the people involved. So they're trying to get more involvement by women who plant cocoa, because they have all this untapped knowledge, because they've actually been looking after the farms for generations. And I thought that was a really nice way of approaching the problem. Speak to her.
That is super, super, very inspiring. Kayana?
I'll just quickly say that in my system, yeah, I totally agree that having farmer participation is really important. And I've actually done a number of questionnaires with farmers to ask them about their perspectives towards tortoises using their land. And their insights have been really important, and their voices are definitely something that will make my study a lot better, and they're, having them participate in those discussions as well is critical. Thanks.
That is wonderful. And I think we are actually reaching the end. We have just 1 minute left. And so I just wanted to ask if any of you have any closing thoughts or any final comments you'd like to make, or maybe tell us about next steps of research that you're planning so we can stay tuned for updates. If anyone has any closing thoughts, please feel free. Jaime.
Okay, in my case, when I talk about the cocoa, and also different questions, like we found that normally the people believe that only one kind of insect that is the responsibility for the pollination, but we found that there are a lot of pollinators we don't know, and also we have found a lot of kind of new species, because that's it, is like Colombia, a lot of diversity, and we have to face that. But when we do this work and we try to work at night, we find there are a lot of diversity and a lot of different interactions. For that reason, when I saw the different interaction in cocoa with bats and different kind, I get interest, because I found this kind of interactions, but with a small scale, with different insects, ants, and different kind. And I believe we have to reproduce this, what is happening, because here is the one thing, what happened in Colombia, but what is happening in Africa, what is happening in other places. What is the difference about the forest and the structure of the forest, to see what is going on. And maybe with this increased production, we can help also the restore of the forest in Colombia and also in other countries. Also help the farmers, because they are the first person, because if they have economic problems, they just cut down the forest. And that's the next step, to get involved with the people.
Thank you, Jaime. And I think we will actually have to close on that note, because we're 1 minute past. So really, thank you so much to all of you, and let's continue the conversation in WUBA. This has been a super interesting question, a super interesting session. Thanks really a lot.